Where is North America? Obviously here somewhere, but where exactly? The three countries that are almost always considered part of North America are Canada, the US, and Mexico. But Mexico is connected to Central America, thus including Belize, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama in North America. And speaking of Panama, it's connected to South America. And if you disregard the Panama Canal, then North and South America are one continuous landmass, which is why Latin America and some European countries say that they're one continent. But Spanish people still say that there's a North America. Norte Americano is an alternate name they use for people from the northernmost country in the Americas, the United States. Seriously, Latin America, Canada is obviously the northernmost country. Or maybe it's Denmark. Or more specifically, Greenland. Greenland is closer to North America than to Europe, so should it be considered part of North America? But Greenland is pretty big, and it's not connected to mainland North America, so maybe it should be its own continent. Take a look at this map. Greenland looks pretty big. In fact, it's about the same size as Africa, right? Wrong. On this map, Greenland is distorted because of the Mercator projection. The Mercator projection was made specifically to make navigating while sailing easily, so it didn't really matter that much that the northern and southern landmasses were distorted. In actuality, Greenland is 2.166 million square kilometers. Put that into perspective, Africa is 30.22 million square kilometers. You could fit almost 14 Greenlands in Africa. But how does it compare to the smallest continent, Australia? Well, Australia is about 7.692 million kilometers squared. So you could fit 3.5 Greenlands in Australia. Not really a continent, but then, what is it? It's geographically closer to North America, but it's historically closer to Europe. But it's not connected to mainland North America like Alaska is, nor is it politically part of any North American country like Vancouver Island and Newfoundland are. But it's so far from Europe that it's not part of that continent either. But politically, it's a Danish constituent country. But by that definition, New Caledonia, Guadeloupe, French Guiana, Mayotte, and French Polynesia are all part of Europe because they're part of France. And speaking of overseas administrative subdivisions, what about Hawaii? It's in the middle of the Pacific, not close at all to the North American continent. But it is closer to North America than it is to Asia or mainland Australia, so is it part of North America? Well, just because land shares the same country doesn't mean it shares the same continent. Take Russia and Turkey. They're both part of Europe and Asia. And Russia used to be part of North America before they sold Alaska to the United States. Russia was once part of 3 continents. So, since it's not unheard of for a country to span multiple continents, what continent is Hawaii part of? Nowhere. Quite a few regions aren't considered part of any continent. New Zealand, contrary to popular belief, isn't part of Australia. It's nowhere. But since pretty much everyone thinks it's part of Australia, for all intents and purposes, it is. Except most definitions of continents say large continuous landmasses as opposed to islands. So that means that Japan, Madagascar, the UK, Ireland, the Philippines, Iceland, the Bahamas, Cuba, Palau, and every other island country aren't part of any continent. And speaking of islands, what about the Caribbean? I know I just said that by the dictionary definition, islands aren't part of any continent, but seriously, who would say that Japan isn't part of Asia, or that the UK isn't part of Europe? It's off the coast of Central America and Mexico, but it's off the coast of Venezuela as well. But it could be its own continent. Antarctica isn't really one contiguous landmass, just a bunch of islands, all smaller than Australia, covered by an ice sheet. So if it's a continent, then that means that other archipelagos like the Caribbean and the South Pacific are too. However, I added up the area of most of the islands in the Caribbean, and their total landmass is about 232,441 kilometers. That's less than the size of the United Kingdom. And what about Iceland? It's closer to Europe than it is to Canada, but if Greenland is part of North America, then Iceland is closer to North America. Okay, we should step back a bit and try to figure out not just where North America is, but the Americas. The Organization of American States, which I know sounds like an organization of states in the US, but it's countries in the Americas. Antigua and Barbuda, Argentina, Barbados, Belize, Bolivia, Brazil, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Cuba, Dominica, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, El Salvador, Grenada, Guatemala, Guyana, Haiti, Honduras, Jamaica, Mexico, Nicaragua, Panama, Paraguay, Peru, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Suriname, the Bahamas, Trinidad and Tobago, America, Uruguay, and Venezuela. This organization doesn't include the overseas regions or constituent countries of France, the UK, the Netherlands, or Denmark. However, this is because they aren't independent countries. It would be silly to say that French Guiana or the Netherlands Antilles aren't part of the Americas. Also, the organization didn't include Cuba or the Dominican Republic at one point. So organizations aren't really a good way to decide continents. Then how about everywhere west of the Primordian is the Americas? Well, then France, Spain, Portugal, Algeria, Morocco, Mali, Mauritania, Senegal, the Gambia, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Cote d'Ivoire are all part of the Americas. Everything west of the Primordian not connected to another mainland, that still means that the UK, Ireland, Cape Verde, and those Spanish islands in the Atlantic are part of the Americas. So, how about the Americas is South America, Central America, the Caribbean, Mexico, the USA minus Hawaii, Canada, Greenland, and Iceland. So, now that we have the Americas, we have to divide it up into North and South America. The obvious thing to do is say that North America is north of the equator and South America is south of the equator. Then North America gets Central America, the Caribbean, Mexico, the US, Canada, Greenland, and Iceland. But it also gets Venezuela, Guyana, Suriname, French Guiana, most of Colombia, part of Ecuador, and part of Brazil. So how about we say that they're split at the Panama Canal, similarly to how Africa and Asia are split at the Suez Canal. But that still leaves the Caribbean islands ambiguous. The North American tectonic plate includes Greenland, Canada, the USA, Mexico, Cuba, the Bahamas, Guatemala, and Belize. But that's not to say that the rest of the Caribbean and Central America belong to South America. There's also the Caribbean plate, which includes the rest of Central America, Jamaica, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and the Lesser Antilles. Except that it doesn't include Panama. That's its own plate. And the North American plate includes half of Iceland and part of Siberia. And South America's tectonic plates are confusing too. Yeah, tectonic plates. Part of Peru, Bolivia, and Chile are on the Altiplano plate. And then some of Ecuador, Colombia, and Venezuela are on the North Andes plate. And we aren't even sure if some plates exist. There might be a Greenland plate. We are not sure. So, where is North America? I don't know. You probably clicked on this video hoping for a definitive answer. Nope. This organization doesn't include the oversized regions, okay? I mean, hey, Greenland is pretty oversized regions. Like, Denmark, you're puny